slight change of title, though. In this, for this I can only blame myself, not translation from or to the Polish. The Hebrew press in the Tsarist Empire emerged around 1860 and catered mainly for the Yiddish-speaking Jews of the Pale of Settlement and Congress Poland, the largest Hebrew reading congregation in the world and the largest Jewish community in the 19th century Europe. Appearing within a network of Jewish journals in Polish and Russian, Yudjenka, Izraelita, Dien, Vashod, Rasvet, and others, the Hebrew press was the only part of this network of Jewish journalism which evolved in the mid-1880s into a daily press, testifying to the leading role it played among its reading public. Of all the Hebrew press that catered for the Jews of the Russian Empire in that period, and certainly of all the Hebrew newspapers that appeared in the empire at that time, the Warsaw-based Hatzfira, the Dawn, then a weekly newspaper, was the only one which was published in a town that witnessed a pogrom. The Southern Storms, as they were nicknamed in Hebrew, erupted in southern Russia in spring 1881 and lasted on and off until summer 1884. Yet the first year of pogroms, between the spring of 81 and summer 82, was the most traumatic and considered by some historians of East European Jewry as a watershed in the whole of modern Jewish history. This year of crisis marked the awakening of a modern Jewish national movement, prompting immigration waves called aliyot that settled Palestine and eventually led the way to the birth of political Zionism. Violence reached Warsaw after it has been ravaging southern Russia for about 8 months. And Hatzfira addressed this troubled period from a distance that was both geographical and, I would claim, cultural. The pogroms were a Russian thing, quite alien to Congress Poland, with its long history of Polish-Jewish cohabitation. Yet, after the mob ruled the streets for 3 days, Hatzfira had to come to terms with grim reality. Warsaw was not immune to the ill winds that blew from Russia. As a newspaper, it was Hatzfira's task to offer its readers a first-hand account of what had happened, while as a Jewish newspaper, possessing the power to influence and shape public opinion, it was Hatzfira's duty to explain why this happened in Warsaw, as it did before in Elizabethgrad, Kiev, and Odessa. Equally important for the newspaper was to advise what the Jews were to do at present or in the future in order to better their condition. Surprisingly enough, a first-hand account of the pogrom, which took place virtually outside the editorial board's window, does not exist in Hatzfira. Reading its issues starting December 27th, 1881, according to the Julian calendar, and all through 1882, it is impossible to find a single, original, first-hand report on the matter. Instead, the overwhelmingly majority of reports published in Hatzfira were copied from other, mainly Polish newspapers, like the Kurier Kurane, Kurier Warszawski, Nowiny, and others. In order to explain how that was possible, it is necessary to clarify a few of the fundamental journalistic features of Hatzfira that were shared with all of its counterparts in the Hebrew press. From the time of their appearance around 1860 and well into the 1880s, it was a common practice for Hebrew newspapers to copy reports concerning current affairs from the non-Jewish press. That is because the Hebrew press at that period was a very modest enterprise which could not support a paid network of reporters, and as a result, its display of current affairs from outside, from the non-Jewish world, was, for the most part, unfresh or even outdated. In the case of Hatzfira, the best example for this practice would be the long-lasting use it made of copying telegrams from the Kurier Warszawski, which were then published in Hebrew in a later date as old news. This recycling process ceased only when Hatzfira became a daily in 1886, and when it finally acquired its own subscription for the Great Northern Telegraph Company. The only piece of news that any Jewish newspaper in that period could rightfully claim as exclusive originated from the internal Jewish sphere, Jewish news, was produced by correspondents or field reporters who were Hebrew-writing Jews working for the most part voluntarily and communicating their reportage in letters sent to the newspaper's editorial boards from all over the Russian Empire. Those correspondents sending in reports about various occurrences in and around their communities constituted the journalistic backbone of the whole of the Hebrew press of the time, and by 1881, Hatzfira too relied on a loosely established network of such reporters. With these technicalities clarified, we return to the initial question: why all the reports in Hatzfira about the Christmas pogrom in Warsaw were copied and not originals? One of the obvious reasons was the fear of censorship breach. Though this, I wish to emphasize, was only a secondary factor in Hatzfira's journalistic incompetence. Indeed, the reports describing the fire scare at the Church of the Holy Cross, the stampede that followed, as well as the descriptions of the violence spreading through town, were copied and translated from Polish, while meticulously quoting the names of the newspapers from which the texts were taken, sometimes even specifying the number of the issue. Quoting so specifically was, on the whole, untypical for the Hebrew press, where whole articles from non-Jewish newspapers were routinely plagiarized, and these actions might suggest that Hatzfira's editor was making an exceptional effort not to get into trouble by upsetting the censor, hence limiting himself to quoting journalistic reports that were previously approved for publication. Indeed, it is known that following the outbreak of violence in southern Russia in April 1881, meaning 8 months before, Tsarist censorship limited Hatzfira's publication about Jews only to non-Jewish politics and general topics, forbidding it to publish any current event concerning the Jews in Russia. It was also forbidden to refer to Jewish persecution or mention Jewish immigration, as if thousands of Russian Jews were not rushing to the borders in a desperate attempt to leave the country. At the same time, it is also known that following these censorship limitations, Hatzfira's publisher managed to petition high-ranking officials in St. Petersburg and secure temporary mitigation. Later in that decade, in 1888, Hatzfira's printing house was closed down by the authorities for 2 months for allegedly jeopardizing Russian-German diplomatic relations in one of its articles, efficiently stopping the newspaper's publication and endangering its continuation. Once again, Hatzfira's editorial managed to lobby St. Petersburg bureaucracy and negotiate the reopening of the newspaper's print house. Russian censorship policies and their implementations were chaotic, impulsive, and unpredictable. Yet the history of the Jewish press in Russia shows that the number one cause for the discontinuation of publications was lack of funds and not censorship restrictions. This offers further proof that Hatzfira's publisher and editors, like the publishers and editors of other Hebrew newspapers, knew how to cope, and if necessary, approach directly or even bribe Tsarist officials in order to secure the continuation of their publications. In other words, censorship was not the main obstacle which compelled Hatzfira to rely on second-hand reports of the Warsaw pogrom. The truth is that in 1881, almost 6 years since Hatzfira returned to Warsaw after spending a year in Berlin, it had no permanent correspondent supplying it with local Jewish news from the Polish capital. Reading through the newspaper's issues from 1879 to the end of 1881, one finds more correspondences published from St. Petersburg, Odessa, and Minsk than from Warsaw. A single local correspondent writing under the pen name of Ben Hashiloni, who later revealed himself as M.I. Henschel, published a handful of random local reports in the period before the pogrom, but was evidently no longer residing in Warsaw in 1882, as he reappeared in Plonsk and continued to send reports from there. Thus, Hatzfira relied on second-hand descriptions of the pogrom, mainly because it lacked the journalistic infrastructure to supply it with on-the-ground reports. The fear of censorship breach was present, yet was not a dominant factor. While Hatzfira's ability to supply its readers with on-the-ground reportage in an attempt to describe what happened in Warsaw was determined by logistical limitations, its efforts to explain the reasons for the pogrom were heavily influenced by its ideological stances and those were to a large extent set and dictated by the newspaper's founding publisher-editor, Chaim Zelig Sloninsky. That's a good sign. Sloninsky, also known as Chazas, the acronym of his name with which he signed his articles, was born in 1810 in Białystok, where he was raised and received traditional Jewish education. He was a Talmudic prodigy, a self-educated scientist and an inventor who left his native Lite, Lithuania, in 1838 to settle in Warsaw. He was famous among his co-religionists for the Hebrew books he published about mathematics and astronomy, and was similarly famed among both Russian and Polish intelligentsia, as well as among the astronomers of Warsaw, with whom he maintained strong ties. In contrast to all other publishers in the world of Hebrew press, who were virtually unknown outside their local communities before they founded their newspapers, Sloninsky entered the publishing business as what we would call today a celebrity. When he started off in 1862, he made use of his fame to promote his journalistic vision, a newspaper published in easy-to-read Hebrew, which would illuminate the world of science to a public whose knowledge of the outside world was limited and relied mainly on religious texts. Sloninsky was disinterested in current affairs and journalistic debates. He had a natural distaste for politics, was indifferent to poetry and literature, and, being an admirer of Western Europe and German culture, he suspected any Russian philosophies which were adopted by parts of the Jewish intelligentsia. Otherwise, Sloninsky was careful not to upset the Russian Jewish money barons in St. Petersburg, as they would periodically assist him with their political connections or with their funding. Those money barons opposed Jewish immigration out of Russia because they feared it might make the Jews appear disloyal to the Tsar. And like the Tsarist censor, they disliked this topic to be discussed in the Hebrew press. In the words of those who knew him, Sloninsky felt more at ease observing the stars than with dealing with human affairs. And whereas Sloninsky was responsible for Hatzfira's ideological stance during the period of the time discussed here, there was another man who was responsible for the newspaper's ideological stance as it would evolve in the years to come. Nahum Sokolov was a journalistic prodigy and one of the prominent founding fathers of modern Hebrew journalism. To this day, the Sokolov Award for Journalistic Excellence and Outstanding Achievement is bestowed annually in Israel. He was born in Vyshogrod, Ports Gubernia, around 1859. He received a traditional Jewish education in various Hasidic courts, while at the same time he acquired extensive secular knowledge to the greater part by himself. He was a polyglot who, by the time he was 23, had mastered 8 languages, and his journalistic activity in the Hebrew press commenced in his youth, around his 15th birthday, when he published correspondences in a variety of Hebrew journals. Sokolov entered Hatzfira's editorial board as a humble assistant in 1880, yet his outstanding publishing output supported his quick promotion. Already in the early 1880s, his writings filled most of the pages in every issue of Hatzfira, and he was made executive editor. In 1886, he was appointed co-editor, and by 1894 he took over full control of Hatzfira, effectively ousting Sloninsky and serving as the newspaper's editor-in-chief until 1916. One of his many talents lay in his ability to explain complex ideas in a wide spectrum of topics in simple language, which made it an immeasurable contribution to the expansion of knowledge and to the development of a political consciousness among his readers. Hatzfira's portrayal and analysis of the pogroms in the whole of the Russian Empire, the answers it offered to the question why it happened and what are we to do, was deeply influenced by the journalistic personalities of its editors. Hence, it reflected a shifting balance between Sloninsky's careful, apolitical stance on the one hand, and Sokolov's more assertive approach on the other. In the remaining part of my paper, I will attempt to demonstrate this shift through a summary of Hatzfira's reaction to the year of crisis through a selection of articles that were published from the beginning of the storms in April 1881 to roughly the winter of 1883. Hatzfira's initial response reflected a timid approach. The reports about major outbursts of anti-Jewish violence in southern Russia were not printed on the front page, but for the first few weeks they were rather limited to pages 3 or 5 of every issue. Only on the 24th of May, almost a month since the pogrom started, did they make front page news. But even then, Hatzfira did not change its fixed format, in which every issue began with an article dedicated to foreign world politics. Accordingly, the May 24 issue, reporting the pogroms on the front page, did so as if it were discussing an occurrence in Western Europe or in Turkey. Otherwise, this report compared present occurrences with a similar traumatic wave of violence in the same region, that of the Khmelnytsky massacres of 1648-49. At the beginning of June 1881, Sokolov, an ardent student of Jewish history, compared the southern storms with the massacres which accompanied the medieval crusades. Both those comparisons suggest, to my mind at least, that by that time, a little over a month since it all began, Hatzfira was defining the wave of pogroms in terms of a major historical event. By the end of June, reports about Jewish refugees trying to flee Russia began, in defiance of both St. Petersburg's censor and the Jewish money barons. In August 1881, Sokolov brought up the comparison between the Jewish question in Russia and in Congress Poland. Anti-Semitism was a German invention that was imported into Russia, he claimed, and the fact that it was cultivated in inner Russia, where Jews resided only in small numbers and hence were not well known, proved that the anti-Jewish sentiment did not grow in Russia from below, from the people. Accordingly, the logical conclusion was that instigators from inner Russia or their representatives were responsible for inciting the mob in southern Russia. The Poles, on the other hand, claimed Sokolov, were tolerant towards the Jews. They, the Poles, quote, maintained the old covenant and the grace towards the ancient Israelites, and they asked to live with us as brothers, sharing the same opinions and language, unquote. A month later, Sokolov traveled by train from Warsaw to the Volga region and published his impressions in installments through September and October. Listening to the passengers' conversation on the train traveling through the Lublin area, Sokolov addressed the fear that anti-Semitism in Poland, and especially among the simple folk, Am Haaretz, might express itself violently as it did in Russia. His answer to this fear was that the Polish intelligentsia would never subscribe to the anti-Jewish discourse the Judophobic press was distributing. When arriving in Kiev, he noted that the hatred towards the Jews was strong among the people there, hence the nihilists who instigated the violence, as Sokolov seemed to believe, only needed to kindle a small spark in order to start a big fire. Coming back from the Volga region to Poland via Pinsk, Sokolov thanked Polish tolerance, which kept the Jews safe. Then again, he wrote, quote, better not call the wolf out of the forest, unquote. A month and a half after publishing his travelogue, the pogrom broke out in Warsaw, and Hatzfira's reports accentuated instances of Polish gallantry among the mayhem. A list of the righteous among the nations like Pan Filikowski, assistant editor to the Kurier Warszawski, saved Jewish lives and possessions. On Ulica Rybaki, the Christian butchers protected the Jews with their axes and drove the mob out of their neighborhood. The Jewish paramedic Reiswasser, whose home was looted while he was attending to the wounded in church, received copious donations from Christians all over town. The overall picture was of a Polish-Jewish brotherhood that survived a malicious attack orchestrated by someone from the outside and above, maybe the former Minister of Interior. Hatzfira's reports, published all through 1882 up to winter 1883, seem to indicate a certain disillusion with the pro-Jewish benevolence of the Polish intelligentsia. Polish merchants and nobles were organizing to drive Jews out of business in different Polish towns. In St. Petersburg, a committee assembled to discuss future limitations to be imposed on Jewish innkeepers, sought the advice of 2 Polish magnates. Hatzfira voiced fears that any sanctions imposed on the Jews of the empire will be all-inclusive, thus sanctioning Polish Jewry with their Russian brethren. In winter 1883, Hatzfira reported that a Judophobic newspaper by the name of Rola was published by Jan Jelensky, and about at the same time, Jan Matejko was embroiled into accusations and libel suits following his alleged anti-Jewish remarks. Still, insisted Hatzfira, the source of some of the Polish intelligentsia's anti-Semitism was German, as was the most anti-Semitism that was then spreading through the Judophobic press in Europe. And the root feeding these poisonous notions, as Sokolov wrote, was in the, quote, garbage gate of Berlin, unquote. Finally, Hatzfira gave its answer to the question, what should the Jews do? Initially, the advice was to increase their acculturation, so they would not be a segregated and hated minority. Hatzfira was at first suspicious or even antagonistic to the idea of a secular Jewish nationalism and the settling of Palestine as a possible solution for the Jewish plight in Russia. Around 1883, the idea was already enthusiastically promoted by other Hebrew newspapers, like Hamelitz in St. Petersburg, but Hatzfira remained lukewarm for years to come. A decade later, Sokolov even opposed Theodor Herzl and his attempt at securing an international charter for settling Palestine. Only later, during the First Zionist Congress in 1897, was Sokolov converted into Zionism during a personal meeting with Herzl, and only then did Hatzfira forego its skepticism, and thereafter became the formal mouthpiece of Zionist movement. To conclude, Hatzfira, one of the most prominent Jewish journalistic organs of its time, and the only newspaper to be located in a pogrom-stricken town during the storms of the early 1880s, was not sufficiently developed to offer on-the-ground reports for its readers. At the same time, Hatzfira's coverage of the waves of violence that preceded the Warsaw pogrom disclosed its ideological and political stances at a critical moment in modern Jewish history. The plight of the Jews in the Pale of Settlement was reported from afar, and fears were expressed that Polish Jewry would similarly be subjected to violence or to the same restriction opposed on Russian Jews by the government. Hatzfira reflected the belief that anti-Semitism in Poland was restricted only to the lower classes, and trusted in the pro-Jewish sentiment of the Polish intelligentsia, while refusing to acknowledge that the Judophobic expressions of this intelligentsia could be anything but imported from the outside. Finally, as opposed to its counterparts in the Hebrew press, Hatzfira refused to adapt a positive stance towards Jewish nationalism until the end of the 1890s, when it embraced Zionism and became a formal mouthpiece for the movement.
Thank you very much, John. So I would like to ask Professor François Guérin from University College London to make a commentary.
Reading these three papers, I wondered why. Why do we look at newspapers? Why do we look at the press in order to understand the Warsaw pogrom? Why do we look at the press in 2015 in order to understand the Warsaw pogrom? Not surprisingly, all three case studies or main perspectives, the perspective of Hatzfira, the perspective from the Rola, the most dynamic, although probably not as influential as often thought, anti-Semitic weekly, edited by Jelensky, as well as the Russian press, which we heard about in a very impressive range of cases, exercised the usual delusion, the usual wishful thinking, the usual stereotyping which the press of the time practiced for a number of reasons. First of all, newspapers were other things than they are today. I mean, they were very much political mouthpieces of attitudes and Weltanschauung, worldviews of their time. So you wouldn't necessarily pick up a newspaper in order to know what happened yesterday, because especially within Tsarist Russia, it was not really the best source of information. All three speakers have addressed the issue of censorship, which is obviously very important. From my work with John Clear's study about 1881-82, I learned that censorship in Russia almost broke down in the spring and summer of 1881 because the events were so overwhelming and so rapid that the censors were not actually able to keep track on the Russian language press or the press published in Russia. So the censorship was somewhat less strict in Russia in 1881, at least for a significant period of time, which is different obviously for Poland. So the use of the press published in Congress Poland in this period is especially tricky, and I myself worked a lot with this press because it was under not only the usual Russian censorship, but it was under the double Russian censorship of the press in an unruly irredentist province of the empire. So very little movement takes place in this press. So what do we find in the press itself? So I as a sort of parenthesis, I express my reservations that we can stop when we want to understand the pogrom of 1881 in Warsaw by looking at the press. We have to use other sources as well. We have to use ego documents. We have to use police reports. We have to use other material as well, which is not a critique of the speakers who did a fantastic job, but just to remind us that what happened in Warsaw on Christmas, in the days of Christmas 1881, is an event which we need to understand more deeply. It comes in obviously a watershed in Jewish history, watershed in Russian history. It is also a watershed in the history of anti-Semitism. It is very important to keep in mind today how strong Eastern European commentators felt about what emerged in the German Empire in 1879, the emergence of the anti-Semitic movement. That was conceived of a major shift. This was perceived as a major shift. The most cultured nation in Europe, or the most progressive or dynamic nation in Europe, would take on the Jews in a very, very outspoken way, in a movement which was very successful in this period. So that informed the debate very deeply. The event takes place in a context of ongoing high tensions between Polish and Russian political actors. It's a period of conflict. It's a period of suspicion, or mutual suspicion, obviously. So what we read in the newspapers of the time needs to not only be taken with a grain of salt, but also be integrated in this larger context. And it is quite interesting that I'm grateful to Agnieszka that she insisted so much on the terminology of the period, speaking about the Judenhetzer, where I talked about the interesting fact that German academics today call the Kristallnacht a pogrom. They use a Slavonic term to designate a major event on the pathway to the genocide of the Jews. And in the same way, the Polish press, and not only the anti-Semitic press, also the Jewish Polish press, and also the Polish press, not the non-anti-Semitic Polish press, would use the German term Judenhetze. The same process of exterritorialization of something uncomfortable. The uncomfortable thing is that people hate the Jews and do something about it. I mean, they attack Jews physically, which was not what you should be doing if you are an intelligent, well-educated person. I think that Agnieszka central conclusions about the way Rolla understood understood the program are absolutely valid. That Jeleński took away the lesson that he needs to agitate in the Polish public in order to prevent something good coming out of the pogrom, namely that Poles understand that Jews can be really under attack, although the stereotype would be a different one. That one needs to prevent processes of social integration which would come in the wake of the pogroms, very relevant, and that one needs to prevent the emergence of an anti-Semitic alliance between Jewish public intellectuals and liberal Poles. So the rationale of Jelensky and Rolla, which interestingly enough was only expressed way later, seems very, very plausible. What I find interesting, it's always obviously wonderful to read anti-Semitic texts. One element which I found interesting, which would be really interesting to follow up in police reports and so on, is this reference to the Domy Publiczne, the brothels. Because we have if we take into consideration the discussions we had earlier today about the re-establishing of a social order and a balance between communities, if this is the case, I would obviously it is mentioned here as an attack on the Jews. Jews had brothels, but we know that Jews had brothels. So what would be interesting is whether this attack on Warsaw Jews during these days of rioting would really target brothels, as would happen in 1905 in the famous Jewish riots, the so-called Alfonsen pogrom, which was an attack of artisans and Jewish workers on the red light, the Jewish run red light district in Warsaw, which is a somewhat, also Scott Urey in his book understates this event, which I found quite interesting. So I can only say that this is a very interesting and relevant insight. The discussion of our colleague Norkina is also very obviously valid. The German term Schadenfreude applies here. So Schadenfreude is the pleasure which you derive of the misfortune of somebody else. So the Russian press was so happy about this Warsaw pogrom because finally the Poles were pushed from their high horse. I mean, they're after months of pogroms in Russia. Here it happens in Poland as well. The Poles are not better people and cannot prevent something very similar to happen. What happens, and what I think, because we had this broad range of examples of cases of Russian publications, press publications, is that it is fully integrated into the Russian discourse of the time. Very few Polish specificities are taken into account. For example, the Otechestvenny Zapiski insists that, and this is really the Russian debate about the emancipation of the Jews, that you need to give Jews equal rights. Well, in Poland, 20 years earlier, in Congress Poland, Jews had received almost equal rights in 1862. So this cannot really be an argument for this journal to use that this would prevent anti-Jewish violence from happening, which is an indicator that from Russia, I mean, what happened in Warsaw would be really seen and interpreted through the lens of the ongoing Russian debate. What I found, again, a semantic issue, what I find really remarkable is that in all your examples, the press uses Żyd as to designate the Jews. I mean, Żydowski and Żyd, never Jewrej, never Jewryjski. So this is obviously and I would like to know more. Why? Why is there no? I mean, in 1881, this would already be. This would be rather colloquial or denigrating. I mean, this would not be high standard Russian. Jewrej would be the more neutral notion, which I would expect, for example, the official Russian press to use. Overall, quite obviously, the event in Warsaw was considered as an exculpating event, an event exculpating the Russians being under a lot of pressure from what happened since April 1881. Dansegev's discussion of Hatzvira reminded me of my reading of Israelita, although there's a difference because Israelita has a lot of people on the ground. But it reminded me of Israelita in its disconnectedness from what is really happening in the community and the difficulties to connect and as is true for many other press publications of the time, Hatzvira, as Israelita, as many others, these were really educational endeavors. They had an ideological project, in the case of Hatzvira, to enlighten the rebel, in the case of Israelita, to Polonize it. But they were not very close to the community. In the case of Sloninsky, I mean, Sloninsky was a Litvak, not a late Litvak, an early Litvak. The intentions are very clear. I mean, you described it very well, I believe. What I found interesting is that when Sokolov takes over, I always read Sokolov as really much more down to earth. He really, I mean, I read a couple of articles by Sokolov about Jewish farmers, about Jewish workers, where he really went to see people and went to so what I found surprising in your discussion of Sokolov is that he does something which Motzkin would do in 1910, together also with Yitzhak Grünbaum, when they published this first major volume on the pogroms in Russia in 1910, published by the Zionist organization, that they shield the Poles from critique. So in a certain way, what Sokolov is doing is that he turns a blind eye to the degree, to the extent of anti-Jewish sentiment in the population. Which I found a bit surprising because I always thought that Sokolov had a better grip on things happening. What I find interesting, extremely interesting, is this very rapid integration into the wider context of Jewish history, the history of suffering, the history of rejection, and I fully comply with, agree with your interpretation that the very momentous events of 1881 were integrated into the larger framework of Jewish history, and also by doing so, putting it already in the time itself on a very high level of relevance. I mean, people really understood that this was a major watershed. Okay, I think that's all I needed to say. All in all, I think we can understand these three presentations as a starting point, a very valid starting point to understand what happened and how it was understood by the people sitting in editorial boards. But I think it would be very important that we reach out for additional sources and records in order to get a better understanding about what happened in Warsaw during these days, and I think we should learn more about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, François. Before responses of our authors, I think we have a few minutes for short comments or questions. So, any questions, comments? Professor Makowski.
One general question to the paper by Ekaterina Norkina. You divided analyzed press into two groups, I mean conservative and liberal one. So my question is, what did it actually mean in Russia in 1882 that the paper was called liberal, and what did it mean that the paper was called conservative? Because when in Russia was no political life, so which factors decided the attitude toward the economic factors or the attitude toward the West or something else? because we should, in my opinion, precisely define this criteria, because liberalism in Russia meant generally not the same as in Western Europe. Yeah?
Thank you very much. More questions? Professor Andel?
Yes, trying to connect the first and the final paper. According to Sokolov, as represented by Segev, the source of hostility that manifested itself in the Russian Empire in 1881 was actually in Berlin. This is not Sokolov alone. This was quite a common theme that was sounded regularly in the Jewish press and elsewhere for quite a long time. In that connection, it's interesting to note that the stance taken in Rolla that was described, that is to say that violence is not a particularly good or helpful way to foster the cause of those who wish to prevent further Jewish integration into the surrounding society, is also something that you hear in parts of the German anti-Semitic movement from the early 1880s. Theodor Fritsch, for example, his anti-Semitism or anti-Semitismus stated explicitly that one does not beat Jews. This is simply unbecoming of a German. So my question is, did the people of the Rolla Circle, whose work you analyzed, read the literature of the German anti-Semitic movement? To what extent were they familiar? What kind of exchange was actually going on between these two locations? I'll also make one observation in response to Francois' wonderment about Sokolov's reticence to speak in the wake of the events in Warsaw. I think we have to remember that from late 1879 through the beginning of 1882, Sokolov was compiling his major statements on the emergence of the anti-Semitic movement in Germany through the violence in Russia in book form, in Sinat Olam La'am Olam. And that was the primary vehicle through which he analyzed the situation, not the pages of Atzvira, where he was still, at this point, a junior figure. So I think that may help you out with your conundrum. And finally, for Dror, why did Atzvira not have a Warsaw correspondent?
Thank you very much. Professor Bilavich?
I have one question to Dror about the attitude of Hatzvira to intelligentsia and the sense of the kind of exonerating explanations that they were putting. So always when discussing the anti-Semitism, if intelligentsia is anti-Semitic, it must be influenced by either Germany or Russia. The question is that this is a topic which is kind of long maintaining in the Jewish attitude to the Polish society in general, the sense that intelligentsia is somehow better. What do you think would be the roots of that? Would it be because at that time in 1880s, intelligentsia was still a pretty fresh social class, if it can be called a social class. Did they affiliate them with the history with simply noblemen, whom many of them were originating from? What was the reason of having this, being so selective in perceiving the anti-Semitism? Intelligentsia is somehow excluded from the problem.
Thank you. Professor Daniel Grunberg?
I have a question to all three. Well, first, do we know any situation in which they were attacked people who were formally stopped to be Jews because they changed their religion into evangelical or Augsburg or even Christian or even Catholic? And second, who were both, which category of Jews were most hated? Westernized or traditional kapociarze, Michała Ciarza.
Here? No questions? So we have 20 minutes because we are waiting for glass of wine, I think. 20 minutes for our authors. So, Agnieszka?
To Professor Engel, you are absolutely right that the reception of German anti-Semitism was quite influential and big in Rolla. I wrote an article on it. And Deering, Treitschke, Stecker, Alvard, astonishingly not Wilhelm Marr. There is no mention about him, but about the others, absolutely yes. And to Professor Greenberg, the conversion in Rolla, it is an ambiguous problem because Jan Jeleński was quite open to the conversion, but on condition it should be absolutely honest. And what does it
How
mean?
to measure this honesty?
It's very, abstract category. So if it is honest, yes, Jew should be converted and he's opened or she's opened in our circle. And you ask about which type of Jew was most hated, assimilated or traditional. It is a famous statement of Jeske Choiński, the very influential publicist in Rolla, who said that the difference between traditional Jew and assimilated Jew is such that the first one believes in something, whereas the second one doesn't believe in anything. And it is the problem. So assimilated Jews were the most hated in Rolla.
Thank you. Tina? I think that we can use English and Russian, yes? Can we?
Да.
Хорошо, давайте, пожалуйста, по-русски.
Когда я отбирала, пыталась структурировать эти все газеты, я исходила из главного принципа, которым отличаются эти два направления именно в еврейском вопросе. Либералы всегда видели решение еврейского вопроса в отмене ограничений для евреев. Именно вот эти ограничения вызывали весь негатив по отношению к евреям и разделяли в остальном массу населения, а консервативные, соответственно, наоборот. Наверное, в этом прежде всего я делила. Хотя я понимаю, что для 1881 и 1882 года это очень условно.
Sure. I would like, with your kind permission, I will stand because all this certainly is not doing me good. I would like to start by answering Francois, if I may. The pogrom was discussed in Hatzfila. I couldn't really expand on it. Tsagolov was using a very known technique known to the readers. It's discussing anti-Semitism elsewhere. 1882, you get the Tisa Essler trial and Rob Leibel case. And he talks about anti-Semitism in Hungary. He writes about anti-Semitism in Hungary. He writes about anti-Semitism in Romania. And it's clear to the readers of Hatzfila, of course, that he's talking about Russia. That was a well-known technique that was used all the way to Bialik's poem about the Kishinev massacre, which was titled at first Mosanemilov, of course. But then again, the ideology was stronger than reality in this respect, and you were right in saying that, at least in this case, newspapers were supposed to reflect the concept of the publishing editors. But it was possible to do it in a Hebrew newspaper, in a Hebrew weekly, because nobody except Jews read Hebrew. And the censor was a Jew or converted Jew himself, and once you were in the clear with him. Warsaw was also a periphery for the main censorship office, which was in St. Petersburg. Every now and then they had to shout fire, fire to show that they are doing something, but otherwise, of course, you were taking a certain risk. But you could get across to your readership if you wanted to. There were all sorts of known techniques to everyone. So that's about Sokolov. Now, Sokolov at this time is a 21, 22-year-old fiery young man, just got the job of basically filling most of the pages of Atzafila. In his memoirs and in the Jubilee book of 1912, he relates to this period, and he says that I wrote as much as Chazas permitted me. Now, about the intelligentsia, I would say that every Hebrew newspaper was first and foremost very concerned about its readership, and Atzila's readership at this point was the Polish Jewish bourgeoisie, who were relatively well-off people who had time to read the newspaper in their spare time, and they were very Polonized. So personally, I think that these 24, 26 months since the pogrom, to my mind, they reflect complete denial on the part of Sokolov, because it's Sokolov. Chazas was pretty much out of the picture. He wasn't interested in these things. But I think it reflects pretty much Sokolov's denial. It reflects the orientation of the newspaper vis-a-vis its readership, that was very well enmeshed inside Polish urban middle class, generally, not all, but generally. So blaming it on Germany, I do believe they believed it, but it was also a very convenient resort. Otherwise, in his later memoirs, Sokolov reflects the complete belief that this pogrom was instigated by Russians. There's no two ways about it. I hope I answered your questions.
Thank you very much, George. We have a few minutes, so if you have any questions, okay, I know, glass of wine. So, thank you very much. Thank you to all our speakers. I think that during our project, we'll try to connect to position. I mean, one, like research of representations of Warsaw pogrom in press, about research about social imagination, and the second one, traditional. I mean, from the sources like Gendarmeria documents and other one. So I said that, in my opinion, we need to make a new research. We need to research Warsaw pogrom again, because we find the new Russian and few Jewish sources for this topic. Thank you very much for today. I think we have 10 minutes to